I don't know if you've ever seen the Friends episode where Phoebe gets a cold and she's a singer in the local cafe. She sort of gets a cold and then all of a sudden her singing voice becomes really sultry and edgy and cool and she sounds like a new Bob Dylan and she's suddenly really popular. And then her cold goes away and her popularity and allure also disappears.
Right.
And hopefully I'm at the early stage of Phoebe Buffay cold where it's still sounding a bit like sultry rather than me just all bunged up and unpleasant.
I, on the other hand, am just at the point where I think I'm about to get a cold, which is in that sort of prickly, slightly grumpy, can I take enough vitamin C to get rid of it phase. So I've not got into husky yet.
Oh, wow.
I'm just grumpy.
See, my cold came about because I was at Greenwich Observatory last week in 0-degree temperature to meet the Wicked film cast as they turned on the lights at Greenwich Observatory because they were looking to the western sky, which is sort of like Wicked plug. But, you know, chatting to Jeff Goldblum in Arctic conditions was not on my bucket list for 2024.
On the other hand, it's quite a classy way to get a cold. I mean, if you're going to get a cold this winter, which most of us are, it's quite a good way to start it.
Yeah, that's true.
Chatting to Jeff Goldblum. Did you see that amazing bit of film of him playing the piano at St Pancras Station? So cool. Love that.
I think it's a complete coup for the film, casting-wise, to get Jeff, jazz musician supreme Goldblum, to play the wizard.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant bit of casting.
Speaking of jazz, we should actually also mention we've now added music to the start of the WhatsOnStage podcast due to popular demand.
At least in our households.
Yeah.
Good for something that start. I think it's very jolly. I like that little start. Let us know what you think.
My brother actually was like, it's a really good podcast, but I think you need some music at the start. And it's like, what, you can't just hard launch into our voices. He needs to be eased in.
It's a very odd thing, music and podcasts. This is an inappropriate anecdote for many reasons, but I quite often use podcasts to put myself to sleep. And
hopefully not this podcast.
Obviously not this podcast. I do put a timer on it so that, you know, I'm listening and then I know I'll go to sleep after about, 15 minutes or whatever. And then I do listen, listeners, to the rest of the podcast, so it's not a bad thing to say this. But sometimes they have very, very loud music in the middle and that wakes me up. That's disaster.
Especially if it cuts to adverts.
Exactly.
And then all of a sudden you're sort of getting one of those sort of like subconscious ads that you need to buy a new dishwasher from in the middle of your sleep.
Yes, probably explains a lot about me, actually. Anyhow, it is very exciting to have a theme tune.
Yes, we should probably introduce ourselves before we continue nattering.
So I'm Sarah Crompton and Chief Theatre Critic for WhatsOnStage.
And I am Alex Wood, Managing Editor for WhatsOnStage. But we have new roles in a way for our very special festive preview this week.
I am Scrooge.
And I think I'm maybe like Santa's little helper, here to bring some joy in the shows that we've chosen to preview on this week's episode.
It is, so that is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about our Christmas shows. But when we were trying to divide the roles in advance, I mean, I absolutely naturally fall into the role of Scrooge. I do love Christmas, I have to say. I've had many, many happy Christmases. But there's something about the run-up to Christmas that does me in. And that I walk around going, grrr, when I see the Christmas lights, and getting very bad temper when people start to talk about their present shopping and their general organisation, which I think is because I always fail to do that. And this whole idea about 'tis the season to be jolly, I tend to go with the view that it's the season to be a bit happy, but I get quite gloomy as well.
'Tis the season to be melancholy.
Yeah, and to cry a bit. I quite like the sentimental side of Christmas, I think, more than the AI Coke advert side of Christmas.
It's funny whenever we do our review commissions for December and late November that anything with the word panto in it does not go anywhere near your inbox because there's no point.
No point at all. I've done my share of panto down the years. I accept that it's a really valid and wonderful theatrical form, and I've even enjoyed some pantos down the years. But now I actually really like the Lyric Hammersmith panto, and Oxford Playhouse used to have a brilliant panto. But now, anything Mark Panto, I run away screaming loudly.
Yeah. Thankfully, there's more than enough to keep you satisfied. So, what would be your first pick? Shows to see over December.
Well, so it is interesting coming up to December because I think it's so interesting for theatres that they have to rely on their December, January shows to make a lot of money for the year. It's really, really important for theatres, particularly in the regions, to make money with a Christmas show. You can't afford a flop at Christmas, just like the supermarkets can't afford nobody to buy their food. And so I'm always intrigued by what people put on at Christmas, because I do have that sense of wanting to be melancholy and wanting to think about the troubles of the world as well as to escape from them. I do always tend to choose a show that moves me and that involves me as an emotional person rather than just simply saying, jingle bells and throwing my hat in the air. So A War Horse, which is on tour at the moment, I think it's landing in Oxford over the Christmas period, was one of my more perfect Christmas shows because it is deeply emotional about suffering, but it has a sense of bringing hope, which is, being serious about it, I suppose, is what I feel Christmas is about, that you acknowledge the sadness, but you bring hope. And so War Horse would be a good choice for me. The Almeida in recent years in North London seems to have gathered around its head my own personal sense of gloom and has done an astonishing run of grim Christmas shows. So it did Spring Awakening. It did Nine Carols.
Yeah, during COVID, wasn't it?
During COVID, which was one of the bleakest Christmas shows. Even I was sort of thinking, this is a bit much. And I think it also did Cold War, which is a wonderful play with songs, but incredibly sad about a relationship that cannot survive communism, essentially. Just kind of the most miserable show. This year, the Almeida is putting on Rebecca Threcknell's Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which seems to me a wonderful choice of a Christmas show, and I think would be my top choice for Christmas.
Gets the number one spot.
Number one spot. I'm sorry, do my top three in the wrong order, but
Kingsley Ben-Adir and Daisy Edgar-Jones on the poster there with some fantastic supporting players
Lenny
as well.
James, who,
Claire
travel
Burt.
a long way. Yes. Yeah. Claire Burt, Mrs. Harris, my first Mrs. Harris.
It's interesting, it's also got Chris Harper attached as a producer. Famously one of the most prolific West End and Broadway producers. So I expect there'll be life after the Almeida for that one.
Yeah, and I think, Rebecca Frecknell directing Tennessee Williams' classic difficult play. Really, really, Tennessee Williams always is a challenge. But I think Cat on a Hot Tin Roof is a particular challenge because there are a lot of hidden themes within it. There's always the question about whether Brick is homosexual, and that's the reason that he doesn't want to be with Maggie. The character Maggie herself is such a rich, complicated figure. The politics of the South sits in the background, and I'm absolutely fascinated to see what Rebecca does with it and what new themes emerge, because I think she did Streetcar Named Desire 2 years ago, which is now coming back in February before going to America. So that will be something that people might want to look out for.
That was another one of their festive shows, I believe.
It was.
With Patsy Ferran and Angela Varson and Paul Mescal.
Paul Mescal.
Another normal people star starring in a Rebecca Frecknell revival of a Tennessee Williams play at the Almeida. So
there you go.
They know what works, don't they?
Yeah, she only works with people who've worked in normal people. I'm really looking forward to that. Classic play, classic introduction to theatre, great cast, great director. What's your top pick as Santa?
Spreader of joy. I'm actually going to start also in North London. I'm going to go from 3, 2, 1. But I'm going to start with a show that I saw in Edinburgh that is now transferring into London's Park Theatre, which is Cyrano by Virginia Gay's adaptation of the original classic, and takes the original Cyrano de Bergerac tale, turns it on its head. By about the play, Christiane, the romantic lead in inverted commas, is fed lines by Cyrano, the true lead, to try and woo Roxane, the female ingenue. In this version, that's sort of the moment where the whole play collapses.
Yeah. Because
Roxane essentially realises that she's being deceived and, essentially has been manipulated by two men. And at this point, it all kind of falls apart, and it's a brilliant sort of iconoclastic take, very different to the James McAvoy version that came out a few years ago, directed by Jamie Lloyd. This is worlds away from that. But I think most importantly, and actually touching on what you were saying about joy and tragedy and melancholy, it pulls apart these undercurrents of problematic themes within a play and then upends all of that and dismantles essentially what's going on the stage, and then chooses in the end to just find joy out of the communal celebration of live entertainment and being together. And I think that joy is something that never feels more present than it does at Christmas, when you're coming out of the cold quite literally into a warm theatre to try and find a sense of community and a sense of connection. And plays like Cyrano really have that in spades.
I think Cyrano, actually, I also saw that in Edinburgh, and I think that very much falls into I could have that on my side of the balance. It is a wonderful production and keeps all the complexity of the play, but does genuinely give Roxanne agency and interest, and is, absolutely moving. And I think you're right, that sense of coming together at Christmas is why people like the theatre. I always have a very strong memory when my first theatre visit is a Christmas visit, and I went to see The Princess and the Swineherd at the Library Theatre, and I could tell you very, very little about it. But I do remember that in a very cold, very rainy Manchester, walking into a room that had red seats and sort of golden light from the stage. And I think that sense of belonging to something and having a story told in front of you is the magic of Christmas, and is what theatres, whether they're on the jolly or the more emotional side of things, that is what you're trying to tug audiences with, I think.
Not to delve too deeply into the anthropological or the sociological aspects, but also the economic side of it, in terms of, like you were saying about pantomime and programming over Christmas. This is the time where so many venues need to fill their coffers to last the next 10 months of programming, because this is when they can pack out 10 shows a week with audiences. And for a large portion of those audiences, this will be the only time in the year that they'll go to the theatre, or they have the sums available to go to the theatre with their family. And especially younger audiences going to see shows like pantomime, where it is their first show. And even if it's not pantomime, Christmas is often the time where younger audiences might see their first show. It's vitally important to make sure that show feels like it's an embrace in one way or another.
And I think what I do note is that I feel that there was a point in the 80s where pantomime particularly got very cynical, and it was just, you got somebody out of EastEnders or Coronation Street to star, and you just put on a fairly standard show that was made to a formula. What I do feel about a lot of the Christmas shows as I look across the country now is they're very wholehearted. And even though I will not personally be attending them, I do think that they are genuinely an attempt to embrace people. And I love that. And I love that sense. There's some, for example, I do feel I've seen a lot of Christmas carols in my life, but there are some terrific productions. Birmingham Rep's got Mark Gatis's, which is a wonderful adaptation. The Old Vic for about 7th year.
As long as I've been at WhatsOnStage.
And people who've been to see John Sims say that he is just outstanding in it. So I do think that sense of wrapping people up with love and saying, come into the theatre, is very good, which takes me to my second choice.
Excellent
which
segue.
Absolutely doesn't do this, but it might, who knows. The Little Foxes at the Young Vic is a fascinating choice of show, because it's a Lillian Hellman play, not much done. Lillian Hellman is such an interesting figure, and we might devote an entire episode of the podcast to her, in the sense that she was huge at one point and had a lot of Broadway success, was caught up in the anti-communist purges of the 50s America, which I think damaged her reputation in the latter half of the 20th century. But people are finding her again. One of the things about Hellman, she writes such brilliant parts for women. And Regina in Little Foxes is the great part, most famously played by Betty Davis in the movie. And a woman who decides to assert her right to share in the fortunes of the family business, and in doing so kind of destroys everything. Anne-Marie Duff is taking this part, which I can't wait to see. Anne-Marie Duff is one of my favourite actresses. who has such a presence on a stage. I'm really surprised that it's on there. So I think it will be riveting.
You've so far only named shows that have animals in the title. You've had War Horse, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and The Little Foxes. Not to preempt, but I feel like there might be a Swan Lake coming later.
Yeah, but there is, yeah, okay, that's my theme. Yes. That's what I'm doing.
This is a stealth podcast. It's just
so I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because that seems to me it's just there. I may be wrong, and I haven't seen it yet. It opens this week, next week. But it's a gamble, that one.
Yeah.
But because it's a gamble and because I am resolutely resisting tinsel, it's the one I'm off for.
One insight I've had looking at the programming for London and the rest of the country, as I do for sort of our Christmas roundups on WhatsOnStage, is it does feel as though venues outside of London are less able to take the risk when it comes to programming shows that aren't the festive staples or don't immediately scream joy.
Yeah.
Whereas in London, you can have the Little Foxes, you can have the Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and I think that those venues will know their audiences will come. Obviously, some will still program big panto bonanzas, but actually you've still got that variety that, it's harder to find that in sort of like the regional circuits beyond places like Oxford, where you've got tours that will sit down for a month and bring in audiences like Warhorse or Hamilton in Cardiff, which is quite an interesting point about what sort of programming venues have to try and do around Christmas time.
And it is just completely understandable. I mean, that does explain the preponderance of Christmas carols and Jack and the Beanstalk. You need titles that will sell. And I as I say, I think the key thing is that the show should be wholehearted in their willingness to bring in new audiences, to offer them really nourishing entertainment. But you can't blame the regional theatres for that. And even the National Theatre, the National Theatre and the RSC have both done new shows in the shape of The Red Shoes at the RSC and Ballet Shoes, which is about to open at the National. But they're also familiar titles. They're not kind of saying, oh, well, we'll find a very obscure 1930s novel and adapt it. They're going for titles that people will know and that will bring them in and that they're intrigued to see reinterpreted for a new age. And that's good. And I think, but also it does play into that sense of you have to have bangers at Christmas. There's no two ways about it. What's your next one? Because yours are more...
Oh, yes. Just a final point on that. Right. I was going to say that it does also mean that some venues, because those big venues are having to take care of the big joy-filled shows, it does mean that you've got some regional venues that have that opportunity to find audiences that aren't looking for the pantos, that aren't looking for the Christmas carols. So if you take something like the Traverse Theatre in Edinburgh, it's got a series of sort of 1 or 2 night experimental new plays or plays that are sort of finding their feet. So stuff like there's a gig theatre show about Mary Queen of Scots, or there's a show directed by Brian E. Shanahan called Trouble in Spiritland that's sort of doing one night or 2 nights, which is a fantastic opportunity at that time where people are looking for shows to see but might not be looking for a panto. They can find that alternative entertainment in somewhere like the Trav. So it maybe gives more oxygen to those smaller venues that are wanting to experiment more with the work they're doing. That's a working theory.
No, but it's really exciting. I mean, that's also exciting. And I think that, it is the time when people will go to the theatre. You have that sense of people planning a theatre trip. I've had a lot of phone calls from people saying, what would you go to? Which I always find really hard. And, texts from friends and saying, what would you advise? And it is a matter of taste, because obviously not everybody's going to want to go to the Little Foxes.
Yeah, it's also people will ask, oh, what should I get as a Christmas present for 2025? And suddenly you have to put on your thinking cap.
Yes, that's true.
What am I going to recommend?
Theatre vouchers.
Yes. So yes, my second pick is it's a double whammy, if you'd let me have a bit of license. I've decided to pick 2 musical revivals playing in Leicester and Sheffield. So you've got My Fair Lady, directed by Nikolai Foster at Curve in Leicester, and Little Shop of Horrors, directed by Amy Hodge in Sheffield's Crucible Theatre. Both venues that have got a very strong track record when it comes to their musical programming, and both like to put on a very big blockbuster musical production every Christmas. So I think in years gone by, Curve's done Evita and Sheffield's done shows like White Christmas in last year.
Yeah,
So
that originated there, didn't it? Did it?
no, that originated at Curve actually. So they did a different production directed by Paul Foster last year. But either way, they know how to bring in crowds that love musicals, and I just know that they're always top quality. There's also some excellent casting in both. So you've got Molly Lynch as Eliza Doolittle
that's
at
interesting.
My Fair Lady,
That'll
and
be
then you've
lovely.
got Georgina Onora as Audrey in Little Shop of Horrors. Two of our most exciting stage talents.
Despite my Scrooge-like cloak for the purposes of this podcast, I have to say I do love a good musical at Christmas. I think that, and White Christmas actually is such a funny musical because it isn't really a very good show, but it invariably makes you feel wonderful at Christmas. And those are such excellent shows. I mean, Little Shop of Horrors and My Fair Lady are absolute indelible enjoyment from both of them, I think.
My Fair Lady feels like a musical that's propping up the regions because it was on in Leeds and now it's on in Sonning, I think, next year as well, and in Leicester. So, it's really every few months there seems to be a new production of it, keeping, bringing in the audiences.
It's one of those shows that everybody knows all the songs in, even if you've never seen it on stage. It's sort of seeped into people, I think. So I noticed that when I have this year done a couple of sing-alongs, and My Fair Lady is one that everybody absolutely knows and joins in. And the other one, which is also a Christmas possible treat, though I might be now taking your thunder, but is Oliver, which is coming in to the
Gielgud Theatre from Chichester.
After a very successful run at Chichester.
Yes.
And it's a brilliant show, Oliver. I just think top musical. But also it's a lovely production by Matthew Bourne with Les Brotherston's designs, which are wonderfully simple but detailed in the way that Les Brotherston does. And I think it's not quite a rethinking, but it's definitely different in tone to Oliver, and slightly smaller scale, slightly more poor theatre, making itself in front of your eyes, and really a terrific choice for Christmas, I would say.
Yeah, it's that joy from melancholy. Joy is a choice sort of show. I actually was watching it in Chichester thinking this is going to work really well in a proscenium march space.
Yeah.
And it's just a really great cast as well. And, they haven't gone for those tentpole Rowan Atkinsons. They've gone for some of the best musical theatre performances like Simon Lipkin, Sinead Holmes, people who just know how to deliver musical numbers with beat perfect accuracy.
And Simon Lipkin makes really interesting choices as Fagin. It's very collusive with the audience and bringing them in, a bit like a musical turn. It has got that sense, which is part of Oliver's origins, I think, of a musical tradition coming through the show.
He's been really eloquent talking about Fagin as a role, how it is a character that's steeped in anti-Semitic tropes and what you can actually do to dismantle those, but also kind of be honest to the material and sort of present those to an audience, because you can't really skirt around them very easily. But the way that he really brings something out of the character, I thought was masterful.
Yeah. And I think it really has been him. I did an interview with Matthew Bourne just before it opened for The Independent, and he said that he was very guided by Simon in how far you could do that and re-examine the character. And they both feel it's very much now Lionel Bart's image of Fagin more than what sort of has happened subsequently in performance. So it's an interesting thing to say. And while we're on the subject of Matthew Bourne, I am just going to mention Swan Lake, which is...
Is that your final pick?
Well, no, my final pick is something different, which hasn't got an animal in the title. So Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake, which is technically outside the terms of this podcast because it's a dance piece, but it is now an iconic dance piece, 30 years old, going out on an anniversary tour, which lasts for a long time after Christmas. So there are plenty of opportunities to see it, and is just one of the great dance shows. Male swans, marvellous retelling of the story. I look forward to it every time. It has been revived quite a lot. I look forward to it every single time, and this is particularly strong.
It's interesting that they have branded it as Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake, The Next Generation.
Indeed.
Which almost is a huge signpost to say, look how many brilliant dancers this production has brought into the mainstream, and the way that New Adventures has allowed this pipeline of talent to exist and present these dancers with these huge opportunities across the country. So it's not just Sadler's Wells for 6 weeks at Christmas. It is 6 months of the year, sellout shows across the UK and beyond.
I think it's now the case that Matthew Bourne at points employs more dancers than anybody else in the country. Wow. If he's got more than one show on the road. And it is utterly true that the moving thing behind Swan Lake is that some of the dancers who are now dancing in it were inspired to become dancers by seeing it. And that's something. And it's very, very well worth catching. But I'm going to. So shall I do my final? Shall I do my real final choice, or do you want to do your real final?
No,
choice?
I think it's you. I've had the last one, so definitely on you.
Okay, so I'm going to go familiar titles again. 12th Night, which is interesting that it's become a Christmas show. I mean, obviously, 12th Night is January the 5th. There is that sense that it holds within it both the melancholy and the joy that, I've been talking about all along. And it is also a familiar title for theatres to put on. People will say, oh, yes, that's that Shakespeare play, and we'll go and see it. So it's coming on in two really interesting productions. One at Stratford, where Samuel West will play Malvolio, quite a young Malvolio. And that's interesting. And then one at the Orange Tree in Richmond, which is a hidden gem of a theatre run by Tom Littler. And has had some amazingly bold programming all year. This puts Oliver Ford-Davies, one of our great character actors, in the role of Malvolio. He arguably is quite an elderly Malvolio. So it's going to be very interesting seeing them both and seeing how that play does resonate sitting at this time of year, with the songs of winter. I think it's good choices.
I was having a funny chat with one of the publicists at the RSC because they acknowledged the fact that they've also managed to programme A Midsummer Night's Dream for the Barbican over Christmas.
I forgot
because maybe we are all dreaming of midsummer during these cold months.
Well, they're certainly sort of cutting their losses, aren't they, with 12th Night in one house and Midsummer Night's Dream in the Barbican.
Yeah, a venue for all seasons. That's the RSC. But no, I think it is interesting that 12th Night has been slowly pivoted into that Christmas Carol-esque bracket of a show for Christmas. But it is also one that, it starts in quite a very sombre, dark place with a lot of loss and ends in a place of reconciliation and joy and discovery about yourself and the love for those around you. So it is very much a festive show in some of the themes. I think that they're onto some winners there, both of those venues.
Yeah. So yes, I'm looking forward to that. So that's my top. What's your last
my
jolly
last
pick?
one? So it seems to be a very strange month in that normally around November, December, we get this slew of big West End musicals opening. And we've got The Devil Wears Prada, which is blockbuster Dominion, but that feels like it's been on for a while because it opened in previews in October and had a run in Plymouth already.
Astonishing number of previews this show,
But it's doing big business at the Dominion, and we always need something filling the Dominion, so that's good. My interesting take for this one is that actually we've got two big shows that are falling into January for their musical press nights. So we've got Oliver, that we've already discussed, but we've also got Titanic, the New York off-Broadway hit, which mashes up the plot line for Titanic with the songs of Celine Dion. So, although it's camp festive joy at its most undiluted. So yeah, very excited for that one. We've also got Leighton Williams, i.e. Strictly Come Dancing, and West End sensation playing an iceberg. So, which is, when I read that press release, just felt like the best casting you could imagine, really.
It does have the most bonkers sense of joy. I mean, it really does. On paper, you just think this is going to be so great. Even I might stop being grumpy and rush off.
It's also nice that it's gone into quite an intimate house at the Criterion, which is a comedy house. And does
nice
really well.
The Criterion, I think.
It's a chocolate box festive venue that needs something with a bit of joy to live in there. And so I think it's going to be a really great space for it. And it's coming with so much clout from New York, where it never actually transferred to Broadway. But I think they knew that actually keeping it as a smaller scale off-Broadway show would be the place where it can find a longer life. I think it will do something similar here, where it will just sort of tick along and bring in audiences that just want a bit of fun. And
it does sound such fun.
It
does sound such fun. And again, there's that golden space. The Criterion's a theatre with lots of gold and that sense of walking into it, a welcoming thing. That gives me a chance to mention another show that's taken a long time, very long time, to get from Broadway, off Broadway, to here, which is Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, which actually opened it actually opened in 2012.
Yes.
And then got to Broadway in 2016.
Yes.
And only now is coming to the Donmar Warehouse and getting a British premiere. Dave Malloy, chamber opera based on War and Peace. I read about it so much and I am so excited to see it. Timothy Sheeder directing.
It's his first production at the Donmar Warehouse, but it's also completely sold out. So
which is why I wasn't in my list of things. But it is. I think it. Again, it's an interesting choice for this time of year.
I was actually mulling over where it could transfer afterwards, because it sounds as though it's going to be, like you say, quite an intimate production. They're probably going to play around with the seating a little bit, so I'd be really interested to see how they also play around with it. If it did transfer, like, would it work in a conventional space, or would it need somewhere a bit more bespoke to land after the Donmar Warehouse? Because the Donmar's programming is quite packed, so it's not like it can just stay there in perpetuity. But given how much excitement there already is for it based on an initial run, surely they're going to be looking to doing something more with it afterwards. But
I mean, it is one of those shows that people have waited for so long to see. People who like musicals and have waited so long to see this show that it really, really needs a bit of exposure. But then we can talk about it.
Maybe the greatest compliment I can give is that it made me want to read War and Peace. So I think that's all you need to put on a poster.
It will be pulling off a supreme feat if it manages to have that effect on me. But let's see.
Perfect. Well, I think that with 6 between us and probably about 40 different shows that we've name checked in between, it's an interesting festive time of year.
I think it's really rich, and I think we look back a lot at COVID and so on, which I think has had such a disruptive effect. I'm so struck by how often people still talk about, it's like before and after the flood, that people still talk about the effect that COVID had. And I think for theatre across the country to emerge as rich and as varied as it is doing makes me feel actually quite joyful. I am prepared to say that it is the season to be jolly, and that there is an immense amount to look forward to in the next few weeks and months into January. And we'll need it in January. Gosh, we'll need all this joy in January.
But there's so much we also haven't even had a chance to name check here, like Jamie Lloyd's Tempest with Sigourney Weaver or something like that we could again dedicate huge amounts of time to. But or The Invention of Love with Simon Russell Beale, or stuff like there's this. It's exciting that now you're at a loss as to what to recommend someone, because there is simply too much going on. And the producers at the Menu, even now, they're all coming to me like brilliant productions. And it's really galvanising compared to, say, 2020, where you'd have about 5 shows to be able to shout about.
Yeah.
Or, even in 2022, when you're essentially shouting about a show that you first covered in 2018 or something, and 4 years later it finally gets its chance to come to the stage. Now it feels like we are actually producing the shows that were conceived in a post-pandemic context, so that they operate very differently and they have very different agendas and aims. And that's a lot more refreshing for a conversation to have.
I'm sure we'll come back to many of those shows in subsequent episodes of the What's on Stage podcast. But for now, it's perhaps time to say goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.
And a goodbye from me, Alex Wood. I'm also going to recommend you follow, subscribe to the What's on Stage podcast, and make sure you leave a comment wherever you can. And we'll be here next week with some more festive ruminations. But in the meantime, have a lovely one.